Today I googled who has been given the most life sentences in history. And honestly, prepare yourself. So just so you know, a life sentence is only given for the worst crimes, and to be given multiple life sentences means that you really did something horrific. So in at number 5 is the Green River killer Gary Ridgway, who confessed to having murdered 71 women and in 2003 was given 49 life sentences plus 480 years. Number 4 on the list is Brenton Tarrant. He's the guy responsible for the Christchurch mosque shootings in 2019. He killed 50 people and injured over 40, and last year he was given 52 life sentences plus 480 years without parole. Taking third is Abdullah Barghouti. He was given 67 life sentences plus 5,200 years without parole. He is responsible for the death of 66 Israelis and was chief bomb maker of Hamas's Al-Qassam brigades. For his sentence, he is held in solitary confinement and is denied all visits. The runner-up on the list is Michael J. Devlin. And get ready, he was convicted of multiple counts of child kidnapping, armed criminal action, forcible sodomy, child pornography, transportation of minors across state lines to engage in sexual activity, attempted murder, and attempted forced sodomy. He was given 74 life sentences plus 2,020 years in prison. And the number 1 most life sentences given to a person goes to a man named Terry Nichols. In 1995, he was convicted of 161 counts of first-degree murder, first-degree arson, terrorism, and for his part in the Oklahoma City bombing. He was given 1 life sentence for each victim killed, which brings his total up to 161 life sentences plus 9,300 years without parole.
Nature's corrupted and such is far away.
Alright, you guys, I almost never give trigger warnings, but this one is rough. So before we get into it, just know that this case does involve violence against children, sexual assault, incest, and murder. So just please, if you're sensitive to any of those subjects, I'll catch you on a different one. Marcus Wesson was born in Kansas in 1946 to parents Benjamin and Carrie Wesson. His parents were really fanatical Seventh-day Adventists, so they were very, very, very strict and very religious. His father was an alcoholic who was allegedly abusive to his 4 children. His father also abandoned the family when Marcus was young to go be in a homosexual relationship with his cousin. He did that for 10 years and then just returned to his family like nothing had ever happened. Marcus was pretty eager to get out of there, so he actually dropped out of high school and enlisted in the Army in 1968. He was 17 at the time. He did 2 years in the Army before he was discharged. Some sources say that he was involved in combat stuff, and some say that that's not true. When he was discharged, he moved to San Jose, California, where he met a woman named Rosemary. She was 13 years older than him, and she had 8 children, and they moved in together. Also, a family member of Rosemary's, also named Rosemary, left her 7 children in Marcus and Rosemary's care. She claimed this was because she wasn't unable to care for them due to her drug addiction. 3 years later, Rosemary gave birth to her first child from Marcus, who was a son. Marcus, however, took a really disgusting interest in Rosemary's daughter, Elizabeth. He even had a fake wedding ceremony for the 2 of them when Elizabeth was only 8 years old. He managed to legally marry Elizabeth when she was 14 or 15 years old. He accomplished this by claiming he had her mother's permission. He was 27 years old at the time. The 2 of them continued to live in Rosemary's house, but they lived on one story of the house, and then Rosemary lived on the other story with her children. 4 months after their wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to the first of their 11 children, one of whom would pass away as an infant. One day, Marcus stole Rosemary's van, and he and Elizabeth and their children just took off. They began this really strange nomad life where Marcus didn't have a job. He just did welfare fraud. The family lived in the van for a while, but then they also lived in a tent and a tugboat, for example. And in 1986, Elizabeth's sister asked them to care for her children as well. So they had a ton of kids living with them in this lifestyle. And Elizabeth was one of those kids, to be clear. So Elizabeth was not allowed to help raise any of the children. Instead, Marcus homeschooled them from a Bible that he wrote himself. It was called The Night of the Light for the Dark. He tried to get it published unsuccessfully. In this Bible, he claimed that he himself was God, who was also Jesus, who was also a vampire. He went so far as to explain that he had a soul, and that was the reason he was allowed to walk around in the daytime and not immediately get turned into ashes. He discussed drinking blood for energy. He discussed polygamy and multiple wives and all this stuff. Mind you, he's teaching this to children. At one point, he purchased antique coffins, these, and he had the children sleeping inside of them. Oh, and of course, he taught about preparation for Armageddon. As Elizabeth continued to have more children, Marcus, who, by the way, made his family refer to him as Lord or Master, continued to marry his daughters and his nieces in fake wedding ceremonies, complete with wedding rings. He was sexually abusing at least 5 of these girls in a ritual that he referred to as loving. This, of course, resulted in several pregnancies. By the way, later Elizabeth would later say she was completely unaware of this abuse because 1, the children never came to her and told her anything, and 2, because when asked, Marcus said that they were pregnant from artificial insemination. These girls maintained his hair for him, they scratched his armpits, and they followed really extreme rules like not being allowed to communicate with their mother or their male siblings. The males, by the way, didn't get treated much better. While they weren't sexually abused, they were physically abused, and essentially, as soon as they were old enough, they just got kicked out of the house. Marcus did this so they wouldn't steal his wives. Marcus did not let the women and young girls go, except for 2 of his nieces. He let them go with the promise that they weren't going to be in a relationship with other men, and that they leave their children behind, which they did. On March 12th of 2004, however, those 2 nieces and some members of their extended family came back to Marcus's house in an attempt to get their children back. They did this because they heard from the rumor mill that Marcus was intending on taking all of their children and moving up to Washington State in a school bus that he'd purchased. You can see that there. He bought it, painted it, and allegedly put a hot tub in it, and of course put coffins inside. When the nieces were unable to get their children, they contacted the police, who at first just chalked it up to like a domestic dispute and didn't do anything. So they called again, and this time the police came out. While this is happening, the children are yelling out of the windows of the house at those nieces, calling them Judas, calling them whore. Those are their own children, by the way, which just shows you the level of brainwashing that was occurring in that house. When law enforcement arrived, they confronted Marcus, and Marcus said, okay, like, yeah, you guys can come in and get the kids, but first I'm gonna go in and say goodbye. So he closed the door and locked it behind him, and shortly he returned covered in blood. Police entered the home to find 9 bodies, 2 daughters of Wesson and 7 that were his children and also his grandchildren. They were stacked on top of one another in a back room, and all of them had been shot through their eye with a .22 caliber handgun. This is not a great picture, but it's the best one I could find of all of the victims. So the victims were 25-year-old Sabrina, 17-year-old Elizabeth, 8-year-old Ilabel, 7-year-old Aviv, 7-year-old Jonathan, 4-year-old Ethan, 1-year-old Marshy, 1-year-old Java, and 1-year-old Sedona. All 9 of these victims were fathered by Marcus. Fresno police claim that they never heard any gunshots, but those 2 nieces claim that they did hear 2 gunshots. This would lead investigators to believe that the children were already deceased upon their arrival, and those 2 shots that were heard were actually Sabrina killing Elizabeth and then herself in a suicide pact designed by Marcus. Sabrina's DNA was also found on the gun, and she was on top of everyone else's remains, which sort of gave credibility to this theory. During his trial, the jury declined to find that he was the one that actually pulled the trigger, but they did still convict him on 9 counts of murder and 14 counts of sexual assault and molestation. Some of those charges included being specific for minors under the age of 14 years old. Marcus was sentenced to death by lethal injection and is currently in San Quentin on death row. However, given the fact that in 2019, California put a moratorium on the death penalty, it is very unlikely that he will be killed by lethal injection and will most likely die of natural causes as he is in his 70s now.